Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the high-stakes, super secretive world of corporate deceit. We're going to uncover the incredibly costly illusion of the perfect hire. We often just assume that the respectable, well-dressed senior managers leading our organizations are, well, inherently trustworthy, right? We basically hand them the keys to the kingdom. But what happens when the very people hired to protect an organization's resources are actually the ones quietly siphoning them away? It's a fascinating and honestly terrifying problem. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how these fraudsters operate, literally right under our noses. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to start with a real-life hiring dilemma faced by researcher and author Terry Sheridan. She was tasked with hiring a locum manager, which is essentially a temporary executive, to run a vulnerable small business while the owner took some much-needed leave to care for a dying father. Sheridan interviewed over 200 candidates, but the decision ultimately came down to two vastly different men. And as she weighed her options, this nagging question just kept echoing in the back of her mind. But can I trust him? Okay, let's dive into this and actually put these two applicants side by side. On one hand, we have candidate A, the desperate man. He showed up with worn shoes, a fleeting smile, and words that just gushed out of him. He'd been retrenched, was facing bank foreclosure on his home, and just desperately needed a few months' salary to keep his family afloat. Now, on the other hand, we have candidate B, the movie star. This guy wore a designer suit, had a flawless resume, lived in a highly expensive suburb, and boasted all these elite connections through his private clubs. Plus, his references were just packed with hyperbole about his brilliance. Now, I want you to ask yourself, if it were you, who would you have hired to protect a vulnerable business? Well, here is the shocking twist that Sheridan actually discovered years later, after completing her research. Absolutely neither of them could be trusted. No way. Both men were, in fact, fraudsters. They were both utilizing a brilliant, incredibly subtle social manipulation tactic called executive impression management. You see, it didn't even matter that one played the desperate, relatable everyman and the other played the flawless, elite professional. Both were projecting this meticulously crafted illusion, specifically designed to bypass our intuition and secure those keys to the vault. Which brings us to part one, the trillion-dollar crime. That personal anecdote perfectly sets the stage for a much, much larger global issue. We aren't just talking about a few missing pens or a forged check here and there. We're talking about a staggering, hidden, and chronically underreported epidemic. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, company fraud causes an estimated global financial loss of $2.9 trillion. Trillion with a T. It is a massive, heavy punch to the global economy. But the cost isn't just financial. When executive fraudsters strike, they destroy businesses, they wipe out people's pensions, and they leave innocent employees facing layoffs, profound betrayal, and honestly, deep psychological trauma. Coworkers often literally need therapeutic counseling because the person they trusted the most turned out to be a complete and total fabrication.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why managerial fraud is so incredibly damaging compared to regular employee theft. The numbers tell a pretty wild story. When a non-management employee commits fraud, they're usually caught within about 7 months. But a senior executive? They're able to hide their deceit for almost 2 full years. 24 months. They drastically outlast a standard employee. And they do this by using their authority, their access, and their carefully managed reputations to just keep the wool pulled over everyone's eyes while the financial bleeding continues, month after month.
Now, you might be thinking that only massive, faceless corporations suffer from this, right? Because those are the scandals that always make the evening news. But in reality, the most vulnerable victims are actually small businesses. Small companies typically lack those complex financial controls, the layers of auditing, or dedicated anti-fraud departments. They rely really heavily on trusting their educated managers. Because of this, when a fraudulent manager strikes a small business, it isn't just a hit to their profits. It's often a fatal blow that forces the whole business into immediate liquidation. So let's move into part 2, a very brief history of managerial deceit.
How exactly did we get here? Well, to understand the modern fraudster, we actually have to look back. Taking advantage of organizational stewardship is for sure not a modern corporate invention. It's really a tale as old as business itself. Let's walk through the history. The origins of managerial fraud actually date back 8,000 years to the Neolithic agrarian revolution. That's when rulers first needed managers to oversee surplus grain and livestock. Jump ahead to 360 BC in ancient Greece, and we find the very first recorded insurance scam at sea. This manager, named Captain Xenothamus, actually conspired to intentionally sink his own cargo ship just to collect the insurance payout. Crazy, right? Fast forward to the 15th century, and the invention of double ledger bookkeeping created entirely new ways for clever, greedy managers to manipulate complex accounting figures right under the noses of their less mathematically savvy bosses. The tools have evolved, absolutely, but that core betrayal of trust, it remains exactly the same.
All right, on to part 3, inside the fraud triangle. So what's exactly going on inside the minds of these perpetrators? Why do seemingly respectable, often super well-liked managers just wake up one day and decide to steal? Well, what's really interesting about this is a foundational concept in criminology developed back in the 1950s by Donald Cressey. It's called the fraud triangle. Cressey actually went and interviewed imprisoned embezzlers and realized that sweeping explanations like pure greed or immorality just didn't fit the bill. Instead, he discovered that 3 specific mandatory elements literally must align for an otherwise respectable manager to commit fraud. Let's break this triangle down step by step. Step 1 is pressure. And this isn't just wanting a nicer car or a bigger house. Cressey defined it as a non-shareable problem. Basically, the manager is facing a financial crisis that they are way too ashamed or too proud to admit to anyone else. Step 2 is opportunity. Because they are a trusted executive, they already have the access and the authority to bypass controls and just take the money secretly. And finally, step 3 is rationalization. They convince themselves that they aren't actually criminals. They'll tell themselves things like, I'm just borrowing it, or the company owes me for all my hard work. It's this exact precise combination that turns a trusted leader into an embezzler.
And the research yields some pretty fascinating sociological findings on where that initial pressure actually comes from. The motivations differ really distinctly between men and women, which proves it isn't always just pure greed. For men, the non-shareable problem often stems from financial issues related to status-seeking behavior, trying to maintain the illusion of immense wealth and success. But for women, the pressure is largely rooted in protecting their children and family from impending financial ruin. So the underlying emotional drivers are totally different, but the resulting fraudulent behavior, it's exactly the same. That brings us to part 4, the myth of detection.
Hearing all this, you might be thinking, well, surely we can just screen for these traits, right? We can spot the bad apples during the hiring process? Actually, scratch that. We have to completely challenge the assumption that we can easily spot these criminals just by looking for obvious warning signs. In the corporate world, we rely heavily on what we call red flags, but traditional checklists are practically mythological because they totally fail to account for skilled liars who easily bypass standard hiring safety nets. Think about it. Psychometric testing relies entirely on the candidate's self-awareness and honesty. Qualities a fraudster completely lacks. Lie detector tests, they routinely give false negatives, especially with psychopathic individuals who literally don't have a physiological stress response to lying. And reference checks, they're highly fallible. They're often distorted by friendship, hyperbole, or even just a previous employer who wanted to quietly push a problem employee out the door. Which brings us right back to the core survival tool of the corporate thief, executive impression management. This is the subtle, highly calculated manipulation tactic used by fraudsters to project a completely flawless professional exterior. It's exactly how they camouflage those non-shareable problems, secure the opportunity to steal, and keep their coworkers completely in the dark for an average of 2 years. It's the reason why your gut intuition alone is simply not enough to stop them. They are, quite literally, master illusionists. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought. Think about the people leading your teams right now, the ones holding the keys to the financial systems. Maybe it's the pleasant, high-performing manager with the perfect suit, or that relentlessly hardworking supervisor. We naturally want to believe the best in people, right? But knowing what we know now about the meticulously crafted illusion of executive impression management, look around your own organization. Who are you trusting? And maybe more importantly, why?